Morning, Matthew. All right, guys, good morning. 8 o'clock, we'll get started. If anybody else dips in, they'll be able to jump in along with us. The two things that I plan on working on with you guys today is both focused on trying to get your essay writing up to speed and make sure that we take care of any DBQ questions that you guys might have. So what I plan on working with today is I plan on working with, first of all, your period 5 concept outline. We'll be working our way through the path of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and have that done. And then also we'll be taking a look at the writing that I returned to you yesterday. And so let me bring you back to this screen first of all. If you haven't filled out the attendance form yet, please make sure you do so. Do it by 2 o'clock. Let me see here. Make sure you're checking out the AP course schedule that's currently up online. The part that they're going to be presenting today, as you can see, is period 3, doing a compare contrast between the Articles and the Constitution. Again, not a bad idea to dip into what the College Board is presenting so you get a different voice. If I miss something during my time with you, perhaps they'll catch it for you. So it's not a bad idea to check out what emphases they have got going on. And in particular, what we want to be thinking about when we're doing our period concept outline reviews is we're now at the point with period 5 where we're going to start taking a look at thematic influences. And we mentioned a number of different themes. You can see them popping up on the left-hand side of your chart that you have right here. And these themes are going to become the foundation for what your DBQs are going to be focused on. They're going to be, you're going to get an essay question like you got with your DBQ that is focused on specific content. But then on top of it, it's going to be focused on how a theme is developed during a time period. Is there cause and effect within that theme? Is there a compare contrast within that theme? Is there continuity and change over time with that theme? So it's rare that you're going to get an essay question that's going to just ask you, hey, tell me a bunch of stuff that you know about the Civil War or whatever. Instead, it's going to be what caused the Civil War, which of the causes is more important than other causes. And that's what makes the essay writing so tricky is we're doing the content stuff right now, reviewing the concept outline, figuring out specific names, dates, and other sorts of things that you need to stay safe. But then on top of it, we have to figure out how to be able to look over a thread of time at what is taking place. So what I'll be checking for, first of all, and this is what I asked you to look over last night, I asked you to take a look at the student sample that I posted for you for the DBQ that you guys wrote. And in particular, what I asked you to think about for today is was there any questions that you guys had as far as the writing process? Were there any things that you needed to have me explain to you better, either issues that were popping up, nitpicks that you thought were going on with the rubric, or other sorts of things? And I'll be watching the chat for just a little bit, or else if you want to unmute your microphone, you are totally free to do so. But that was what yesterday was supposed to be, is giving you a chance to try out this writing. And we had a wide array of different scores. We had some students scoring 9s and 10s, other students scoring 1s, 2s, and 3s. Thankfully, no zeros. But if you're scoring 1, 2, or 3, we're still a month away from the AP test. You're still a good writer. You are still a good student. We've just got things to work on. And most likely, when you look at each of the categories for scoring a DBQ, as I go down to here, the dilemma that you have is that instead of it being like, I got an 8, instead, in these mini competitions you have of doing a contextualization, you either got to the threshold and you got a 1, or else you're slightly under the threshold and you got a 0. And if you are too often going underneath the threshold for demonstrating each of these specific skills, and you rack up too many zeros, that's where a bad score comes from. So it's not that people don't like you or whatever. It's just with these skills, we need to tweak them. And the nice thing is the College Board is giving you specific targets for how you jump over that high jump bar. And your goal is to try to get over that bar without bumping it. In particular, what I found for a lot of kids is with their document use. That was tricky on the DBQ that you guys were just completing. And so if there were documents that threw you off or elements that made it difficult for you to figure out how to get stuff done, we can discuss that today. But then also remember the style guide that I've got right here. If you are looking over your DBQ and you're not certain how to make things better and you don't want to ask me questions, they explore inside this DBQ how to this style guide, what you can do with each element of the AP test to make your scoring better there as well. So I'm going to buzz back and take a look at my chat area. I don't see any chat messages that are coming in right now. So my hope is that you're feeling good with what happened with your essays. If you're not certain how to make that writing process better at the time that you wrote, I'm hoping that you've got ideas about it now. But I'll give you a second. Any questions you guys have that you need help with? Good, good. If that changes during the course of our review today, feel free to pop into the chat there. If it's something that you want to talk to me about individually, this is something that we normally would do at this point of the course, both for my class and then Mr. Quinn and Miss McLeod. If you're taking AP World History, this is usually the time that we start doing writing tutorials from the standpoint of not doing them for the entire class. We have a wide array of different performance levels at this point. Some people are acclimating better to writing the DBQ, others are not. And at this point, one-on-one work is oftentimes what will work out best. And we can easily do that through Google Meet. So feel free to nudge me also. If you're like, I don't want to speak in front of 30 people about the issues that I'm having, then nudge me and we can talk about them individually. I can even bring up your essay on my computer, look over specific stuff. And this is not just reserved for people who are struggling. If you're somebody who's like, I got a 7, I thought I got my document analysis right, I'm not seeing it. The job that I have isn't to make it cryptic, and we're not trying to make it something that's difficult to understand. And in fact, when we came up with this style of rubric, and I've got too many tabs open, in the old days when we were grading, it was really hard to explain to a kid what they need to do to get better. That's what the hope is with this analytical rubric, is to give you enough detail to say, here's what the standards are, and then give you a chance to build up to that point. With that, then, if there are no questions about the DBQ, we're going to take a look then at period 5 today. And with period 5, this is 1844 to 1877. 1844 is the election of James K. Polk. 1877 is the election of Rutherford B. Hayes and the end of Reconstruction. When I look at this time period, the breaking of this time period during the Polk presidency seems really arbitrary. And what I mean by that is this date, there's nothing magical about the Polk presidency that says that we should interrupt a time period. So in my mind, period 4 and period 5 are connected with one another. You'll oftentimes see that in the essay questions that you get. And so one of the easiest questions to predict on a yearly basis is the one that goes from 1820 to 1860, compromise stopped being able to hold back the Civil War, explain why that took place. And you'll notice that then bridges periods 4 and 5, which is what DBQs oftentimes will do. DBQs will oftentimes go from one time period to another so that they can show continuity or change over time, compare or contrast. And so if I was somebody who is a gambling person, the chances of you seeing an essay question that's in that span are really good. But I never give a prediction as far as what I anticipate will be on the test, because I've got no insights other than what my gut is telling me. And that's not a way to go into the test. So I would prepare for each of the time periods equally, periods 3 through 7, that they've just really told you to focus in on it when it comes to the writing process. And 1, 2, 8, and 9 are going to be really good for contextualization, so don't ignore them. And for us, as we get ready to dive in today, remember also your reading schedule, where I laid out for you the dates that stuff is due. I'm going to want chapter 38 read by Monday, and I want to be able to start putting together what's going on in the 1970s quickly. My plan for tomorrow is to review the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and to take a look at other protest movements that were spurred by what was taking place during that time period when the baby boomers ended up in college and protests started becoming very huge. And we'll tie that into current news as well, because we had yesterday a large protest in Michigan where many people are arguing that the loss of their ability to move freely is a violation of their constitutional rights. And so there are many people who are starting to protest around the country who are sympathizing with President Trump that we should be getting back to work rather than sheltering in place. And so you're seeing tensions that are arising currently. And many of the techniques that are being used to protest are the ones that were very much made popular by Martin Luther King, embraced then by the anti-war movement, the hippie movement, and so on. And they became part of our mainstream during that time. So in period 5, 1844 to 1877, then, what we want to be noticing is the scope of what we're going to be covering, manifest destiny leading up towards the Civil War. But what I want you to notice to the left-hand side is they're going to give you a prompt that there is a thematic focus that they think is really important for the content that you see over here. And when you take a look at that, like the idea of Mexican-American War being part of foreign policy with America and the world, what we want to be thinking about then is other times when we saw interaction between America and the world. And you'll see that with, like, going backwards, the War of 1812. The Monroe Doctrine, the Texas Revolution, and going forward, the Spanish-American War, World War I. So these are all on a thread, and they want you to be able to do things like causation with a skill like this. What caused the Mexican-American War? And what you'll find is that our ideas, like the Monroe Doctrine, are going to have an influence then on our decision to go to war with Mexico during the Polk presidency. And that's where your essays will come from on the AP test, is trying to figure out how do we get from point A, Monroe Doctrine, to point B, the Mexican-American War. And that's your next stage in review. So if you find that when I'm going through these reviews, your content is kind of shaky, please go ahead and start fixing that up. But then also keep in mind, the next stage you're going to need to move on to is how do you connect across a theme over time. So we're going to see it started today taking a look at what's going on with your learning objectives. And what you'll find in your study guides is, number one, they're helping you out with your contextualization piece. If you find that contextualization is a skill that on your rubric, perhaps you got a 0 out of 1 on the DBQ that you wrote recently, and you'll find that right down here. This is where you can start practicing that. And in particular, when we think about your DBQs, we want to think about, there we go, the idea that in your DBQs, you'll want to do a contextualization at the beginning, looking backwards, and a contextualization at the end of your essay, looking forwards. You'll find a section about that in your style guide from John Irish. And so when you look down at what he does with contextualization, he highlights the idea that you should have a pre-contextualization paragraph. And it's kind of like a TV show when you're looking back in time and reviewing what happened in the previous episode to provide context for what you're about to see. So you don't just jump into the action without any sort of idea of what this action is related to, what the bigger trends or movements are. And you'll want to explore this in your essay with a solid paragraph. It's not just a throwaway. It can't just be a phrase or a sentence. It's got to be something that you develop analytically. Towards the end of your essay, you can wrap up by pointing out what might be coming up on the next TV show. And it's the understanding that with the theme that you're studying, you're going to be then exploring how that theme continues onward in the future. And you're going to want to explain what relevant stuff happens in the immediate future that is connected back to the thematic topic that you studied inside your essay. That thematic topic, though, is what you want to stay focused on. This sort of contextualization isn't just an event that happens after the time period or an event that happened before that. It's got to be related to your essay topic. It must be relevant to your essay topic and argument. It can't just be a fun similarity. It's got to be something that's actually building on something that is relevant to the argument that you're trying to make. So in this case, explain the context in which sectional conflict emerged from 1844 to 1877. Let me rephrase that question for you so you can turn it into something you're going to be using for your studying. It's asking you to explain the bigger picture of what was going on with the trends of the time period that emerged as we went into our sectional conflict, the Civil War. So leading up to that moment, we became more connected with the world and we were becoming expansionistic when it came to our foreign policy. You'll notice down here, there are many people who are excited about United States expansion. This is your manifest destiny, but this is also our Monroe Doctrine. We have people who are looking outside of our territories. And there was a small section in your textbook that talked about filibusters, where we actually had people like William Walker invading places like Nicaragua to try to conquer them, to make them part of the United States, to expand slavery. Our biggest expansion, though, is going to be manifest destiny, and that leads us to bump into world powers like the English, like the Spanish, like the Mexican government, and that's going to be something that causes tensions. We are going to have a debate over what it means to be a citizen inside the United States. This is referring to immigrants. So remember, we have our rise of a know-nothing party that doesn't like immigrants during the 1850s. We're also going to realize that during this time period, Native Americans are Americans, and we're going to find that they're not being treated with respect or kindness by the United States government. We're going to know that African American slaves are Americans, and they're not being provided with their rights in large numbers, although we've got abolitionists pushing for that. And so we're creating tensions sectionally, and that sectional tension is creating regional divisions, especially over the debate over slavery and other economic, cultural, and political issues. They're all revolving around that idea of slavery and its expansion, though. The differences that we have over slavery, remember that you've got a rising abolitionist movement in the North that is going to start causing problems. And that's something that is happening at the start of the Polk presidency that is a bigger trend or movement that almost everything in the chapter is relating to. When Polk decides to invade Mexico, you could look at that point in isolation, but his decision to invade Mexico is going to anger abolitionists who will notice that Polk announced that we were going to do 54-40 or fight with the Oregon Territory, and we didn't follow through with that fight over northern lands, but we are going to provoke a fight with the southern lands. You learned about the bloody spot resolution with Abe Lincoln, where he argued that we had actually invaded Mexico and provoked this war. And it's something that's going to anger a lot of Northerners. Henry David Thoreau writes his book, Civil Disobedience, because of his refusal to pay a poll tax during this time period and support what he saw as being an immoral war, even though he was only trying to vote in a local election. And so you've got any moments like the Mexican-American War, the movement out to California, all of these events that could on their own just be these meaningless little things that are taking place. They're happening along a trend, which is going to be a big theme. And as you explore that, we're going to want to be coming back to these bigger contextualizations where a lot of the debate is over then what should be done with the expansion of slavery. Our debate over slavery is going to dominate political discussions, even though in the 1840s, you guys learned about something called the gag rule, where they made it illegal to try to bring up bills in Congress that were dealing with the issue of slavery. By the 1850s, that's now done. You guys learned about a Whig party that in the election of 1844, when Polk ran against Henry Clay, Clay loses the election of 1844 because he's asked, what are we going to do with Texas? And his response is squishy. He can't say that we were going to take it because that's going to make Northern Whigs mad. But if he says, if he's not enough pro-slavery, he's going to turn off the South, the Whigs divide. And that death of the Whig party in the 1840s will open up a space for multiple third parties and then eventually the Republican Party. When we get to the Civil War then, we are going to find that during this time period, we are addressing the issue of slavery and secession, But as you guys have seen from the units that we just covered, including the video that I just showed you about the civil rights movement, just because we fought a war over the issue of slavery, the ability of the federal government to create rules that everybody in the United States must obey, nullification, you still see a century later resistance to desegregation movements, insistence that the South has states' rights to do what they want to, especially when it comes to African American civil rights. We're going to have a lot of questions that are unresolved here that we're still wrestling with nowadays. The North has advantages that we want to be noticing that is going to allow them to win the war militarily, and the South will be destroyed both militarily and economically. But then with Reconstruction, we're going to find that we technically end slavery with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We're also going to see the rise of Jim Crow laws, black codes, and other sorts of things that will continue segregation going on in the future. This trend line that you see right here then opens the door for contextualization. If you wanted to put a note over here that this is your first Reconstruction era, and many historians refer to the period of the 1950s and 60s as being our second Reconstruction era, you can easily talk about how the radical Republicans tried to deal with things during this time, and they weren't actually successfully dealt with until like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed by Lyndon Johnson. And again, after we cover this stuff today, that'll be what we review tomorrow, is civil rights and the Vietnam War. Those two videos that you guys watched over the past week will now tie things together to explain how do you make a link between this in the time period of your DBQ and stuff that might be outside the time period, even significantly outside the time period, as a way to do contextualization. So let's run through your concept outline quickly. But again, let me remind you of the things that you should be doing with your review. The College Board is announcing that with Manifest Destiny, they want you to notice that there's a thematic focus that we've been exploring in your course about geography and the environment. If you double back here inside your concept outline, and we come to this page right here, you'll notice that there are different topics throughout US history that have a certain theme attached to them. So geography in the past, and not just dealing with when we get to period 5, Manifest Destiny, but it's also telling you that when you look back at your concept outline, they're asking you to consider the geography and its impact on what was going on with the South. This is your theme. So what's going on with the South and sectionalism with their decision to grow cotton, they're saying has a connection to Manifest Destiny and our decision to move out west and conquer other territories. As you move back to this spot right here, you can take a look around and see that Native American settlement prior to European contact also has a geography emphasis that they would like you to notice. The regional nature of the British colonies, how we ended up with northern and southern colonies. You go from here to here, you'll notice that there's a story that is building, that they're using the geography to be able to flesh out, that you could then connect together how you end up going from one spot to another in US history until you reach this moment. This is where your essay questions will most likely come from, exploring these trends that happen along certain themes. So when you think about the concept of Manifest Destiny, there's all sorts of other topics that can be woven into Manifest Destiny as well. There's political elements, there's economic elements. What I'm not telling you is to ignore those. This is just meant to give you an awareness that you're supposed to be linking across a theme to understand the connections that are happening over time, where they don't want you just throwing in random facts in your essays that are unrelated. If you're writing a Manifest Destiny essay that has to do with the geographic impact on movement out west, and also what that does to our debates over environmental geographical issues moving out west and so on, they want you to stay thematic when you do contextualization. So it says here, explain the causes and effects of westward expansion from 1844 to 1877. They will either ask you to do causes or effects. They won't ask you to do both inside an essay. They'll just give you one. I want to highlight then for you how you can earn your complexity point. If they ask you to just do the causes, and in your essay, after doing causes really well and you crush it in your essay, you're also putting into your essay a discussion of the effects that this movement is going to have as well. This is where your complexity point can come from. One of many different ways that you can earn that point. So it says here that the reasons why we're expanding is number one, natural resources. Number two, people want to move out west for economic opportunities as farmers, ranchers, miners, or to religiously find freedom. This is your Mormons, and then also you have utopian movements that start moving out west. It leads to waves of people moving out to the western frontier. The people who are arguing in favor of this movement are calling it manifest destiny, and there's a nationalistic element to it with the idea that the United States is the greatest country on the face of the planet, and it's their duty to spread American society and institutions from East Coast to West Coast. That's referring to idealistic things like democracy and capitalism. But then there's also the recognition that if they are running into groups that are not white, they're going to get dominated. And so there is a white supremacy movement element that's going on here as well, where they aren't looking to share the land with the Mexicans who are already living in California, the Native Americans who are living out west. And this nationalism is very much emerging following the time of Jackson and the era of the common man, where many common people feel like they are the ones who are the true Americans, not the elitists who are on the East Coast. This movement that we're going to see is boosted by new laws. And let me remind you of the laws that you should have over here in the margin that they're highlighting. One of the laws is the Homestead Act, which is going to give you 160 acres of land to move out west. And this is what your farmers were playing around with during your farm game that we played in January when we came back from winter break. Remember also the Morrill Land Grant Act. They built a bunch of colleges out west to help learn about the new scientific ways to be able to farm. And that information is being given out to farmers, and it's being spread through organizations like the Grange, the Farmers Alliances, and so on, that eventually become our populist movement. And then finally, our government is spending massive amounts of money to help build transportation networks during and after the Civil War, most notably the Transcontinental Railroad, which you learned about through the Credit Mobilier scandal, where we had schemes going on to scam the government. But as long as a railroad was being built, then we were going to be just fine with that. It is during this time that we are going to be going into Asia, and we interact with both China and Japan during this time period. And when we bring our sailing ships to them, especially to Japan with the Fillmore presidency, we're going to start trading. We're going to have more engagement. But especially in the case of Japan, they're going to become much more interested in keeping up militarily and economically. They're going to go through their industrial revolution at this time, and it's going to eventually put them on a collision course with the United States during World War II. When you look at the Mexican-American War, then notice your theme, dealing with the idea of America in the world, and especially focusing on the idea of foreign policy. So when you're doing your review specific content facts, but then also think about the Mexican-American War's place in our foreign policy. This war that is between the War of 1812, our last major battle with the British, and the Spanish-American War, this is going to be our foreign war that's taking place. And you'll notice that it's not in Europe, it's in Mexico. And it's a opportunity to grab territory along the western coast of the United States, especially to build deep sea ports that will facilitate trade between the United States and Asia. So here's your essay question. And again, you can easily see the DBQ coming. It will either be explain the causes of the Mexican-American War or explain the effects of the Mexican-American War. They will give you one or the other. And what you will want to do to earn complexity points is you'll want to ATFQ. If they ask you to explain the causes of the Mexican-American War, the vast majority of your essay should be focused on that. But if you want to show complexity and you're giving treatment to the idea of not just what caused the Mexican-American War, but actually getting into what the impact of the war was also, perhaps even as a contextualization at the end of your essay, you could then be potentially lining yourself up to earn a complexity point that looks good. Keep in mind, though, when I'm giving you these sorts of ideas, when you look at your rubric right here, if I'm teaching you a way to earn your complexity point is worth 1 point total. So it's great to pursue this. You have to be thinking about pursuing all of your points. So I'll have some kids who go crazy and they'll start writing essays that are asking about the cause of the Mexican-American War. They'll go into like multiple paragraphs about the effects to the impact of then not doing documents very well. or not bringing in enough outside information that's pertinent to the topic. And that pertinent topic is going to be what caused the war. So when we think about the causes and effects, mentions here that the United States added large numbers of territories out in the western frontier. And what's going to be happening is we're going to have to discuss the status of slavery, American Indians, and Mexicans in the newly acquired lands. This is your effects. When it comes to American Indians, they're going to be moved off of their land west of the Mississippi River during this time period into what was called the Great American Desert. So that area west of the Mississippi is seen as not good for human habitation. That's where Oklahoma is, Indian territory that Indians are sent to with the Trail of Tears. For Mexicans, they're going to find themselves moving from citizen status to second-class status in places like California. And when it comes to the status of slavery, we've now got a huge debate that's emerging because of California. The debate that was already raging at this time was when we had when we had Texas get their freedom from Mexico. They wanted to become a part of the United States. Andrew Jackson didn't want anything to do with that. Martin Van Buren didn't want anything to do with that. Harrison became president and dropped dead. And John Tyler decided at the end of his presidency to try to steal some thunder from James K. Polk. He tried to add Texas. Everybody in the country understands that if you add new territories out west, it'll be nice because the country's getting bigger. But each time we debate the question of freedom versus slavery, we keep inching closer to civil war. These interactions that we have with these different groups that are living in the areas that are going to be conquered, oftentimes are going to be very much the ones that you are recognizing post-Civil War, where oftentimes treaties are made, agreements are made, and oftentimes they're slanted in favor of the United States government with the idea of pursuing manifest destiny. Now, when it comes to the causes of the Mexican-American War, the United States during Polk's presidency sent negotiators to try to buy chunks of territory from Mexico, and when they refused, Polk sent his military across the Nueces River towards the Rio Grande, and when they did that, that precipitated a war. Over in the margin over here, remember the names, you had Zachary Taylor, who became famous during this war. It eventually helped him to get elected president in 1848. You also had Winfield Scott, the guy who came up with the Anaconda Plan, who was going to conquer Mexico City. And this war is going to be very quick, and it's going to be very much a major victory for the United States. Our problem, though, if we take a look at the issue that we have right here, we are now getting into a thematic question over what does it mean to be American? What should the future of America be? And if you take a look at where we are right now as a country, you can see that we, even nowadays, debating issues with the coronavirus, are wrestling with ideas about what true American policies should be. So when we're debating that currently, we have a number of states around the country who are resisting calls from doctors to shelter in place. And many of them are making the claim of states' rights, that they should be able to make decisions over what they do without the federal government's intervention. We're going to also find that in the North, though, there is a reform movement that is pursuing using the government to try to make social, economic, political changes. And one of the biggest ones is the abolitionist movement. So as we look here, explain the similarities and differences how regional attitudes affected federal policy in the period after the Mexican-American War, you are moving into debates over what should happen with slavery, and this is your sectional debate, North versus South, where you've got tensions that are rising, and our political parties at this time are still mixed. There are still Northern and Southern Democrats. There are still Northern and Southern Whigs. But as we get closer and closer to the Civil War, the parties are going to start looking like the country does, where you're going to end up with a Northern party in the Republicans and a Democratic Party that's both North and South, but is going to be very dominant in the South. And we're going to divide very completely then at that moment. The courts and national leaders will make a variety of attempts to deal with this issue. So let me remind you of each of them. Typically, an essay question that deals with this moment right here is going to be the essay question that I pointed out to you. So when I keep asking you from 1820 to 1860, why did compromise cease to work? It's because of the Mexican-American War serving as a turning point. It's from this point forward that we're going to find compromise becomes less and less possible And the reason why is in 1848, the war ends. 1849, they discover gold in California. And in 1850, Henry Clay has to work with Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun to come up with one last compromise before all of them end up dying within the next 2 years. John C. Calhoun, in a matter of days during the debates, he's going to end up passing away. So when we get to this moment, then you can see that previously one of the compromises that was being made between the North and the South was the gag rule of the 1840s, preventing discussion of this inflammatory topic so that if it's not discussed, then it's not going to bring up legislation that is problematic. But you will want to make note of the fact that with the Mexican-American War, there is something that's being proposed called the Wilmot Proviso. The Wilmot Proviso was created by David Wilmot, and a lot of my kids get confused about what's going on with this provision. It's saying that the American government will get the money to pay for the Mexican-American War, but only if it agrees with Northern abolitionists that none of the territory that we gained out west from the Mexican-American War could be used for slavery. And the problem is they keep removing the Wilmot Proviso. The funding bills for the Mexican-American War keep dying in 1848. And they're now finding that they can't pay for the war, which could cause an economic catastrophe. And it's also inflaming the South because in the Congress, you've got David Wilmot, who is trying to figure out ways to try to put into place federal enforcement of slavery. The thing that then the South is worried about is maintaining balance in the Senate. And that gets thrown off by California. When California decides to become a free state, pursuing gold as their main moneymaker, and they want to add themselves as now the state that will give the North one additional state in the Senate will then become Northern dominated. The House is already Northern dominated, even with the 3/5 compromise. And from this point forward, the only thing that's stopping anti-slavery movements is the President of the United States. So as you move forward, then you're going to find that there are other compromises that are going to be created, like the Kansas-Nebraska Act that is going to be giving popular sovereignty to the states of Kansas and Nebraska. But sadly, that's also going to lead to bleeding Kansas, which is going to cause the birth of the Republican Party. You have the Dred Scott decision that is going to be made by the court system that argues that slaves are property and they can be taken to any territory where the state has not made their own decision in states' rights about if they're going to be slave or free, which is going to be very inflammatory to the North, sending even more Northerners to join the new Republican Party. And you can see how important the whole issue of the Mexican-American War and slavery is, because there's other topics that try to come to the forefront. The Liberty Party is going to pop up during this time period that's anti-slavery, and they're going to be very divisive prior to the Mexican-American War. But after the war, when there's an actual feeling that there's a threat of Southern expansion of slavery, more and more people start gravitating towards that as their big issue. So when you have the know-nothings show up who are anti-immigrant, the thing that Northerners are asking is, fine, how do you feel about immigration, about slavery? And that's going to be something that will determine the life or death of the know-nothings. Eventually, the know-nothings will drift off and join the Republican Party instead. As we take a look at sectionalism then, your sectionalism is focused on the idea that you've got regional cultures inside the United States. So all these people, North and South, will claim that they're Americans. The thing that's weird about this time period, though, is that these Americans will identify with region first. So rather than announcing that they're American, they'll tell you that they're state first, then their region, North or South, and then they'll get around to describing that they're American. When we look at the effects of immigration from various parts of the world during this time, we have massive numbers of immigrants who are coming from Europe, especially from Ireland and Germany. You have a potato famine in Ireland, you've got wars in Germany, and many of these people are encountering stereotypes and discrimination to the point where they're settling in either city neighborhoods that are very much ethnically separated or in farm communities where they can practice their faith the way that they would like to. Following the Civil War, we bring over large numbers of immigrants from China to work on our transcontinental railroad, but policies are put into place that are very much anti-immigrant. For the Chinese immigration, there's actually an attempt to try to bring over only men so that the Chinese immigrants can't reproduce, they can build the train. And then afterwards, when they die off, there's not going to be a large Chinese population inside the United States. There is a feeling that many Americans have that are anti-Catholic against Irish and German immigrants, with the feeling that their language is different, their culture is different, their religions are different, and there's a fear that they're going to take over our country with their cultural views. As we look at this theme then and we explore it further, we're going to find also that we are getting into a discussion over what our social structures should look like. And we're going to want to notice sectionalism, explain how the regional differences related to slavery cause tension. This is sectionalism between North and South. Northerners focused on a diverse economy that has already gone through the industrial, transportation, and market revolutions. And the South during this time period decided to emphasize wholly on cotton production. There's an author that you should have over in the margin here. His name is Hinton R. Helper. He wrote the book, The Impending Crisis of the South. And his argument is the South needed to diversify their economy, not because he wanted to give up on slavery, but because by having an economy that was solely driven by cotton, you were ending up with a few wealthy plantation owners, a bunch of desperately poor farmers, and no diversity in the economy. So the North was becoming richer and the South was not keeping up. We are going to find then that there are many Northerners who are worried about slavery, not because they embrace the idea of equality. There are some Northerners who are worried that in competition with African Americans, white people are going to see their wages start dropping. Remember, this is your free soil movement. So when people are free soilers during this time period, it's not because they hate slavery because they want equality. They're fearful that with African Americans moving out west, that competition would be bad. If you wanted to make a note over here for a contextualization, that same feeling is what led to the Red Summer of Hate in 1919, where Northern factory workers who were white became angry at factory workers who were Black who moved north during the Great Migration because they felt like they were stealing their jobs and depressing their wages. As you look down here then, you're going to see that there's a rise of abolitionists, and they're going to become better at expressing their viewpoints. They're initially a part of the American Colonization Society, but eventually they create the American Anti-Slavery Society. And this is William Lloyd Garrison. This is Frederick Douglass. This is Sojourner Truth. And in particular, also, you can put the book Uncle Tom's Cabin with Harriet Beecher Stowe. And they're presenting the idea that slavery is a moral evil. This is going to lead then to a huge impact because of the Second Great Awakening. And you can use the Second Great Awakening as a contextualization to explain why so many Americans are receptive to listening to this. Some people are helping slaves escape. And with those slave escapes, this is in response to the Fugitive Slave Act. Some people are operating an underground railroad. There are people in the states in the North who are creating personal liberty laws that allows states to nullify the Fugitive Slave Act because their religious people are arguing that their faith does not allow them to become a slave catcher inside their states. So the northern states at this time, some of them are practicing nullification. And you also have some people willing to use violence. And when you see that, that is code for John Brown, who is willing to kill people in Kansas during Bleeding Kansas, who stages Harper's Ferry to try to figure out ways to free slaves. And in the South, you've got people who are arguing, no, slavery is good because it's producing cotton, which is the largest export product. They're creating cotton that also fills the textiles mills and makes our textiles a lot cheaper. But then remember John C. Calhoun, who argued that slavery is a positive good for the country because he claimed that this was good for the slaves, provide them civilization and advancement and protection and all these other things that weren't even close to being real on plantations, but were acceptable to people who are looking for some sort of rationalization. This is also going to lead to an embrace of strict constructionism, the idea that if it's not written into the Constitution, the federal government is not allowed to act on any issues like the issue of slavery. Many of the states that you see here are going to rely on the 10th Amendment to say that they are allowed to do what they want to with their slaves. Meanwhile, in the North, you've got people who are willing to talk about the elastic clause, stretching the Constitution, and then eventually they just break down and they write 3 new amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, to make slavery illegal. As we look at the political causes of the Civil War then, we've already highlighted many of them. The government acting on things like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, you had people feeling like that was going to be the things that held things together. But we are past the point of a Henry Clay holding the country together. And remember, these actions were largely being done by Stephen Douglas, who helped with the California Compromise of 1850. But to get a transcontinental railroad built from Chicago out west, he approved the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You then learn in Kansas how there was like schemes going on, like the Lecompton Constitution, where they tried to create a rigged constitution that would make the state pro-slavery. And you had Buchanan, who was interested in getting that put into law. And eventually, all of these things that are happening are causing compromise to fail and extremists to rise. We're going to enter into then our next political party system, where we're now moving into the third party system instead. The first party system was Federalist and Democratic Republicans. Second party system was Whigs and Democrats. Your third party system is now Republicans and Democrats debating sectionalism into the Civil War and following with Reconstruction. So remember the election of 1860, and when we think about the effects of Lincoln's election, first of all, remember that the election of Abraham Lincoln, it happened because of the fact that the Democratic Party split in half, but there are no Southern electoral votes for Lincoln. He's elected by all Northern electoral votes, and the decision was made at that point that because of what happened with California, the House of Representatives now was controlled by the North because of immigrant populations overwhelming the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Senate was imbalanced with more Northern than Southern states, and now the presidency is filled by Northern as well. And because of propaganda from the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858, there's a feeling in the South that Lincoln is a radical abolitionist. When we think about the military victory that we have here, it says, explain the various factors that contributed to the Union victory in the Civil War. The only battles that I could imagine that you would need to know about are the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day in the Civil War in 1862. And remember, that was the thing that led to the Emancipation Proclamation, where Lincoln said, if you are still rebelling, you don't get to keep your slaves. They're considered forfeit. If you're a border state, though, you totally can keep your slaves, because he wanted to allow the states to figure out for themselves through the Constitution whether or not slavery would be legal or illegal through legal means. We're going to find then also the Battle of Gettysburg is the turning point of the war, where the South tries to invade the North a second time. And the failure in both of those battles for the South to win prevented Europeans from jumping in on the side of the South, like France and Spain did following the Battle of Saratoga. Battle of Vicksburg could also be helpful for you, because this is where Grant finally takes over the Mississippi River as part of the Anaconda Plan right before the Battle of Gettysburg. But when we look at what's going on here, what they really want to be thinking about with the Civil War is the things that help out the North during the Civil War will also lead us into the Gilded Age. And that's going to be the thing that I would like you to really focus in on. North and South will both mobilize their economies. They've got problems on the home front. You have like draft riots in New York and problems in the South where they are a confederacy. The South is going to have great military leaders trained during the Mexican-American War. But notice these elements. We had improvements in leadership and strategy, especially following the Battle of Gettysburg, when Grant and Sherman were put into their positions of power. Key victories like Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg. It's this greater resources piece that I would like you to think about, though. During the American Civil War, Lincoln is going to create the Homestead Act to encourage small farmers to move out west, which is going to provide food for the war effort. Lincoln is going to embrace the ideas of Henry Clay and build up our infrastructure, in particular our trains, and that is going to help then our transportation during the war effort. And Lincoln is going to start providing money in contracts to factories around the country to produce the weapons and the supplies that we need during the war, kind of like Wilson does during World War I, kind of like FDR does during World War II, and kind of like both of those wars. After the war is done, we're going to end up with brand new factories in the North that can produce peacetime stuff that is going to lead us towards the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. And that's the big thing that we want to be thinking about, If you get a Gilded Age essay question, like for period 6, you could easily write a contextualization that explained how Lincoln's strategies of like the Homestead Act, trains, building up factories, created the conditions that allowed the Gilded Age to take place. You can even think about it with Lincoln's actions on the money supply. He is going to be borrowing money in large amounts to do stimulus-style spending. In particular, he's selling war bonds like crazy, and he creates greenbacks to try to inflate the money supply to spur spending during the war. For our government policies during the war, it says, explain how Lincoln's leadership during the Civil War impacted ideals over the course of the war. This is about Lincoln's transformation, going from a person who before the war was very nervous about stepping on the issue of slavery. He wasn't even certain what, as a president, he was capable of doing. And if you listen to President Trump right now, he's kind of having the same wrestling match where President Trump has said over the past couple of days that he has absolute power to reopen states during this economic close down for the coronavirus. But just days earlier, he argued that he did not want to use federalism to force businesses to start making supplies for our efforts against coronavirus. He's in that spot that many presidents are in, where we're kind of reliant on Washington's model to try to determine what the president can or cannot do. So when Lincoln became president, the quote that you should be aware of that's oftentimes hung around his neck is his quote where he said at the beginning of the war, if I could end the war by ending slavery, I would do it. But if I could end the war by keeping slavery, he would do that too. His transformation throughout the war is going to be happening as he starts the war to preserve union. So remember, he starts off the war not wanting to alienate people who may be not interested in slavery as an issue, but they want to maintain the country as a united force. His creation of the Emancipation Proclamation happens after the Battle of Antietam. So that's where you want to be able to link. The Battle of Antietam caused the creation of the Emancipation Proclamation. 2 years into the war, America is not winning, North is not winning the war. The South is still resisting. Soldiers do not want to enlist in the military. And so the idea of the Emancipation Proclamation will disrupt the Southern economy when slaves are freed. Many African Americans could then join the United States Northern military to fight against the South. And if they make the war about slavery, there are many countries over in Europe that read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and they're going to push back against their leaders who might want to jump into this war. Lincoln is then going to come to the idea that we need to have a new birth of freedom. Remember in the Gettysburg Address, he said 77 years ago, our founding fathers brought forth upon this continent a great nation. He was making the claim that in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal is not something that is something that is just reserved for white Americans. He is expanding that viewpoint. He's going to continue that throughout the rest of the war, advocating then for the creation of the 13th Amendment to make slavery illegal. Now, our dilemma is at the end of the war, Abraham Lincoln is going to end up having a victory in the war. Sherman is going to march through the South, take over Atlanta. He's going to win the election of 1865 over General George McClellan, who's running as a Copperhead. But this leads us into Reconstruction. They're going to want you to explain the effects of government policy during Reconstruction. And what that means is you actually have to be able to specifically talk about what changes were made by the federal government, what impact did they have, and then what resistance did they encounter that led us into the environment that you saw in your civil rights video. So we're going to find a century later, the North will win the military portion of the Civil War. They will make substantial changes to root out de jure segregation or segregation by law. But we're going to find that the South is going to be able to codify a pseudo version of segregation and slavery as they try to figure out ways to kind of get around the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So what we're going to find then is, number one, I want you to notice this element right here. We discussed this as a big point in December. African-American men will get the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. It's going to cause a division then where those white middle to upper income women who have been aiding African-American civil rights for decades, they're now going to abandon the civil rights movement for African-Americans, and they're going to start pursuing the suffrage movement. And with the loss of that alliance, African-American progress is going to slow down quite a bit. At the end of the war, we'll create the 13th Amendment that gets rid of slavery. The 14th Amendment gives African Americans citizenship, and 15th Amendment will give voting rights. But what we want to be able to think about is the way that those things are undermined with the failure of Reconstruction we'll look at in just a little bit. You've got the women's movement that moves into suffrage. And we're going to find that there's a battle that breaks out because you do have radical Republicans in Congress who are trying to force Reconstruction. But when Lincoln is assassinated and replaced by Andrew Johnson, Johnson is a Southerner from Tennessee who is sympathetic to slave owners. When Grant becomes president, he is going to be somebody who is focused not just on the South and Reconstruction, but he is going to argue that we need to reopen the country to business with the Gilded Age and take our eye off of Reconstruction. He's going to feel like the racism in the South is too entrenched, so he'll create the Force Act to try to get rid of the KKK, but by that point, they'll have been successful already. I do want you to notice this, though, and this is where many of my students really do badly on Reconstruction essays. They skip a step. So they'll talk about the Civil War, and then they'll immediately talk about how while these amendments were created, nothing good happened for African Americans. With the 13th Amendment, you had African Americans gain their freedom. And where the military was in the South, you had a Freedmen's Bureau that was opening schools and helping give training and jobs. With the 14th and 15th Amendment, you actually had periods of time where local and state legislatures had African American politicians who were elected to leadership positions when African Americans were able to vote freely. And in particular, with all of this, what the radical Republicans realize is unless you give the opportunity to African Americans to vote freely and fairly in elections, they're going to lose their power quickly. When you watch what Southerners are going to do during this time period, then they're going to be trying to figure out schemes to take away the right to vote for African Americans because they will then become powerless to push back against politicians who are pursuing racist policies. And so we're going to find that that becomes a situation not just in the 1860s, but you saw that all the way through the 1960s, where in your video, you saw Mississippi burning. You saw that only a fraction of Mississippi was even registered to vote because they were terrified of the lynchings that would come if they attempted to do so. While the military is in the South, these rights are protected. Explain how and why Reconstruction resulted in continuity and change in regional understandings of what it meant to be an American. In the South, you had white plantation owners who still owned their land. There were some American military people who made the comment that we should be dividing up plantations, and they referred to it as 40 acres and a mule, that we should give every freed slave 40 acres of land and a mule to work with so they become small farmers. Lincoln thought that was going too far. Andrew Johnson definitely thought that was going too far. So you've got all of these slaves who are now free. And I want you to think about the civil rights video that you were watching, and in particular, the discussion of affirmative action. I had a number of people write comments about how affirmative action was going too far. We should just settle for equality. That's what this was. Legally, black and white people were labeled as being equal to one another without having some sort of economic foundation that put them as level with white people. You had African Americans in the South who had no jobs. If you were like that, you would be arrested for vagrancy. And you'll notice the 13th Amendment says that you are not allowed to be a slave unless you're incarcerated. So many people would get arrested and put back into a system of pseudo-slavery. But remember, this is how you lead to sharecropping. Slaves end up becoming freedmen, but then working for planters in a sharecropping system that we discovered back in December was quite rigged to put African Americans deep into poverty. The 14th and the 15th Amendments are supposed to create citizenship and the right to vote, but the Supreme Court in the late 1800s is going to take a very strict constructionist interpretation that these protections only apply to actions of the federal government. And it was argued that the states could handle these amendments the way that they wanted to. Local municipalities could do the same. And with Hayes's election in 1876, we had the Compromise of 1877, where Reconstruction is ended, the military is pulled out of the South for Hayes to become the president, and Reconstruction comes to a screaming halt. You will then have Jim Crow laws, black codes, literacy tests, poll taxes, sharecropping, And while it's not technically slavery, it's close enough that you can see that there's a ton of continuity, even though on the legal books, there's changes that take place. And a lot of kids will jump the gun and they'll be like, well, a bunch of African Americans moved north. They did not. Not during this time period. Some did, but who were they going to live with and how would they get there? And many of these African Americans, once they start freely moving through the South, they'll be labeled as vagrants, arrested, then put into the prison system and catching all sorts of harassment that's definitely not going to allow them to get to a northern destination. And as you saw with the Great Migration, even if they got north, you saw in 1919, decades later, the Red Summer of Hate that shows that the North is not nearly as tolerant as many of us would like to imagine them to be. So if we think about comparison in period 5, the last skill that we want to notice says compare the relative significance of the effects of the Civil War on American values. Number 1, the United States is going to get much more connected with the world. We're going to very much have the benefit during during the Civil War that we had during the World Wars I and II. When you have a war, you have to revolutionize your factories, use modern technologies, and America is going to now become one of the leading edge technological forces so that 50 years later, when it comes to saving Europe during World War I, all eyes from Europe are watching the United States because we've got the factories built up that can do so. We're going to start becoming more expansionistic following the Civil War, especially now that we've got a military that is stronger than anybody in the Western Hemisphere and can challenge the European powers as well. We're going to see then that we are going to be moving into a period of expansion where we are going to see the end of manifest destiny coming in period 6, when America moves not just by taking over territory out west, but actually spreads with settlement and displaces Native Americans in the upcoming unit. We're going to find then that this draws in more immigrants from outside the country, but then it also is going to get us into this debate. What does it mean to be an American citizen, both for African Americans and for immigrants who are moving to the United States? We will find then that during this time period, we are going to have all sorts of different viewpoints happening sectionally in the United States. And this is going to create divisions inside the country. And when the North wins the war, we will see some change happening in the South. But we are going to find that with the issue of civil rights, we aren't going to find a solution comes there. We are going to find, though, that in our future, America is going to embrace a Hamiltonian vision of where our future is going to come from. Hamilton and Jefferson, during your first few chapters, Hamilton insisted our future was going to be in the cities and factories. Jefferson claimed that it was going to come from the farmers. After the Civil War is done, we have manpower and factories, and Lincoln embracing the ideas of Henry Clay and the American system. We're going to have the Union defeat the South in the Civil War. But with Reconstruction, we're going to find that the South is going to still retain an element of pseudo-slavery. We are going to see a stronger federal government in some ways following the Civil War, but we're also going to see a backlash. And essentially, you're going to see that coming from business owners who would prefer states' rights in their own way when it comes to laissez-faire economics, but they're trying to figure out ways to weaken both local, state, and federal governments so business can operate freely without much intervention from anybody. And so we're going to find following the Civil War, our whole issues changed. Once we're done with this time period, slavery, which has been the issue dividing America ever since the time of the Constitution, has now been replaced by what are we going to do economically? What is the relationship of the federal government to large businesses that grew up during the time of the Civil War, encouraged by Lincoln? And we're going to see them grow into great powers to build steel and oil and other sorts of things. But the big question is, should then they be allowed to run their country, their companies without any sort of regulation? Or should there be governmental rules on them to make sure that they're obeying certain behaviors, norms, and standards? This will then lead us into period 6. And period 6 is what we're going to review next week when we come back together. So tomorrow, my hope is that we can take some time to do meaningful connections between what is happening, and let me break this off right here. What is happening between what you just studied, the civil rights, the Reconstruction era of the 1860s, I'm going to bring you back tomorrow then and take a look at the civil rights movement video that you guys studied. So when you guys come to the session at 8 o'clock tomorrow, make sure that you've got your video worksheet handy, that the video plans handy that we went through, and your notes, because we'll take a look at what the NAACP, the SCLC, SNCC, and CORE, and others were trying to do to address issues a century later that weren't resolved with the Civil War itself. Let me take a look over here. And it says here, man, my chat was not popping up in front of me. So let me get to any questions and I'll come back from here. Sophia, you are just a killer. I love having you here. So Amelia's question got answered. Jude's question got answered. Calvin, have you scored all of the DBQs? I scored all of the DBQs up through what I got 2 nights ago. And I sent email messages out with a copy of your essay and the rubric attached to the bottom of this. Let me give me just 1 second, and I realize you see me staring like intently at you. I'm just trying to open up the folder of that to see. And Calvin, I see that I sent yours off to you. And I don't have a time that's identified here, but I sent it off on the 14th. So you should be able to see it in your email messages from me or else in your Google Drive. Let me see here. So for my 2 Sophias, I've got the first 2 chat questions, and I apologize for not getting them previously. What is the best way to earn the complexity understanding point? Let me show you from the rubric the few different ways you can earn it. And in particular, that was what I was going to want to get to next with our writing coming up next week, but it's totally okay to give it to you now, especially as we get started with the weekend. So if you look at the rubric, and I'm going to bring you back to the example essay that we have right here, the way that you have to earn this point is, first of all, you must satisfy these 4 elements with your writing and your essay. And it can't just be merely a phrase or a reference. So when we're thinking about doing our writing, a lot of kids will think, well, what's my magic sentence I need to include? Or it's instead a whole thread of an argument that runs throughout your essay. Or it needs to be a really good section of your essay that's dealt with in like a solid paragraph that pulls off these things. So number 1, you must have a response and a complex argument that is addressing the question itself. So if you think about the essay question we were working with the changing view of independence as we went into the American Revolution, it might be great that you would want to go off on a riff about how John Locke was a philosopher during the period of the Enlightenment. If it's not actually doubling back to the question, though, in some sort of meaningful and substantive way, you're not going to earn the complexity point for that sort of stuff. The next part is what you're doing must corroborate, qualify, or modify the argument. So if you're just straight going down the line and saying document 1 says this, document 2 says this, that's not complexity. You need to be doing something unique and sophisticated to make the question your own and say either this is how I can prove reinforce the position the question's taking, or else if you could qualify or modify the question and your argument in a way that is unique and sophisticated, that's the way you earn your complexity point. And so this element right here is going to be our key that you see going right here. Explain both similarities and differences, continuity and change over time, multiple causes, both causes and effects, but especially this element down here, qualifying or modifying an argument by considering diverse or alternate views of evidence. This is going to be where you bring in your XABY thesis statement, where you'll be able to prove to a reader that while you're asking the question about how American views of independence changed over time, if you're able to really flesh out the idea that for some Americans, they were patriotic from the get-go, like Samuel Adams. There were some who grew into that independence viewpoint, like this group. There were some who were resistant, who are loyalists. It must be related to the focus of the prompt, 3, and it must show a complex understanding of the development. And so what that means is just by using an XABY thesis statement, if you're not writing in a way with like really strong facts and really good analysis, I mean, a lot of times this complexity point is earned by somebody whose essay reads almost like a textbook entry. A lot of kids are trying to figure out what's the magical formula to unlock this. And the magical formula is a really strong essay that dots all the I's, crosses all the T's. And it's doing this. It's considering multiple variables. So if you think about the essay question that you were working with, you were playing around with the idea that perhaps the independence views of the early time period was salutary neglect. But for some Sons of Liberty, that wasn't enough, especially the ones who read about Enlightenment philosophies, while others wanted to be plantation owners, or they were Quakers who didn't care a bit about getting independence, or some of them, like Inglis, was worried about how much this war was going to cost. This element right here, if you're able to talk about, now this is asking about change over time, if you can play around with both continuity and change, like some people's essays were writing about the idea that while some people's ideas of independence developed over time and were explained in the Declaration of Independence, there are elements in the Declaration of Independence that are essentially salutary neglect in a different form. If you can also do a contextualization that perhaps is really good at showing that maybe the essay writers got it wrong by capping the date when they did. Like maybe this essay question shouldn't stop at 1783. So I want you to think back to what you guys just saw with your concept outline here. And imagine you got an essay question about Reconstruction. And instead of stopping with Reconstruction, imagine instead that you made the argument that when discussing African-American civil rights, a really good historical person should look beyond that to like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois. That post-contextualization at the end of your essay might help you earn this complexity point, especially if you earned your thesis point at the beginning. Sorry, your contextualization point at the beginning. Finally, if you are able to prove that you are right in your answer, like let's say you have an essay like the one that you have here for your DBQ, and you're discussing the changing views of American independence, and then you're able to explain that this is not unique to the United States, but let's say that the ideas and the transformation that you wrote about in America, you saw that happening in Haiti, or you saw that happening with the French Revolution, and many kids were really close to earning that point, but many of them only gave like a phrase or a reference. Let's say instead you really explored that in a substantial paragraph that built on connections between it and what was going on with your essay writing throughout the rest of your essay. So you're building up the idea that in America, they initially just want to go back to salutary neglect. They're inspired by the Enlightenment. They're inspired by John Locke. And then you really got into a good riff about how that was then exhibited by the French Revolution with good details. That's how you could also earn complexity. There, like, especially, and this is where I'm going to speak specifically to Sophia because you posted the question. You are like many of the writers that I have in my course at this point, who there are multiple places in your essay where I'm watching, I'm like, if we just followed the thread that you're on for like another couple of sentences, you would then have your complexity point. So it's not that you're doing it wrong. It's instead, a lot of kids will stop short where they're on the way. But the dilemma you also have is you've only got a 45-minute time limit. And so the idea that you spend a lot more time focusing on complexity, which is one point, when you've got 9 other points that deserve your attention too, that's where a lot of kids might not get the complexity point, still get a 5 on the AP test and be great. But that's kind of where the devil is in the details. The kids who pull this off, it's like a machine watching them work, where they're efficiently able to go down their rubric, go bam, 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 bam. And then when it's time to do complexity, they've got enough time left to really run it to ground and be good. Okay. For my other Sophia, would this post-contextualization come before or after the restating of your thesis? It is totally up to you. And that's the dilemma that you have when it comes to this writing process. And this is very much where it's scary to be a dad. Like I've got a 15-year-old who is you guys' age. And it's tricky because there are times when I'll give my daughter instruction and have to trust that she's going to do right in the moment, and without me being there to kind of talk over her shoulder. So I'm going to give you this guidance, and then whatever you decide to do, the placement is not super important, except for the idea that you cannot double dip. So when it comes to your rubric, I need to see your thesis statement as its own standalone thing that earns a point. And the problem that many kids will have, and this is where John Irish's style guide will argue that at the end of your essay, if you think about what would flow the best flow would be for your last paragraph to be a restatement of the thesis, and then like an epilogue afterwards, where you have like multiple sentences that says, over the next few years, this is how this topic could be seen as influencing the next time period. If those two areas blur into one another, where all of a sudden you're doing your contextualization, but it becomes an element that's essential for your thesis, I have to choose on the rubric, is it your thesis or your contextualization? I can't double dip and give you credit for both. So you may find it better at the end of your essay to do the post-contextualization in your second to last paragraph, then restate your thesis statement and have them be distinctly different. Even though it won't flow beautifully, keep in mind, you're not trying to hook these readers like some sort of like popular writer writing a novel that you're selling. You're trying to check things off of your rubric. So if you can stomach the idea that it's not going to be the most beautiful flow, but you're not worried about flow anyways, you're trying to maximize your points, you may want to make them distinctly different from one another, so there's no chance that they will mess up your chance of getting those points. So hopefully that's good. And all of these questions that you guys are asking, this is the beauty of the next month is I'm essentially your style coach. So if you have for example, especially for my two Sophias who asked like the questions that we would be doing in class as like style things that we would grind through in person, this is the moment where you can be asking questions where you can FaceTime or whatever and say, I want to ask you about this paragraph. And we can style guide that out and do all sorts of shaping with that stuff. So if that's what interests you, let me know. We'll be doing more writing in the next few days anyways, so that now that you've got these insights, we can see if you're doing better. I don't see any other things in the chat, so I'm hoping you guys are good. I'll see you tomorrow at 8 a.m. I've already taken too much of your time, and so we'll pick up there talking about what's going on with the civil rights movement of the 60s, Vietnam War, trying to wrap up those elements of the chapter, and then we'll send you into the weekend. It's been great being with you guys. Hopefully you guys have a great day. I will see you tomorrow.